I call the Honourable Member for Murray.
I thank you, Madam Speaker. Imagine your son or daughter, your brother or sister is dying from an incurable terminal cancer, and the only treatment offering pain relief and nausea control is medicinal cannabis. This, fortunately, is not a common situation, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look very carefully at whether we should continue to refuse access to medicinal cannabis in such circumstances. I believe we should allow it to be medically prescribed by specialists and regulated so that those few who need it can be given relief. Some other advanced countries, for example Israel, Canada, 20 states in the USA and much of Northern Europe, have long ago accepted the scientific evidence that medicinal cannabis has properties that make it a valuable last resort drug to give chronic pain and nausea relief where nothing else works for some cancer sufferers. It can also be of assistance for some symptoms of multiple sclerosis for some sufferers, and it can reduce the number and severity of fits that can further disable a child with a particularly rare syndrome. Medicinal cannabis does not give the same high as the illegal street marijuana, which can of course seriously damage the user's mental health with long-term or even shorter-term heavy use. I am not a subscriber to any further decriminalisation of illicit drugs in Australia. Synthetic marijuana is also a dangerous newcomer on the drug market and has recently been the focus of federal regulation to reduce import access. Medicinal cannabis is nothing like these substances. It's in a very different category. It would never leak onto the illegal drug market because it would always be much more expensive. It would only be made available on a medical specialist or expert panel prescription, like so many other pharmaceuticals. We can look to the regulation in, for example, Canada to see best practice where the substance has been available for more than a decade. I'm a co-convener of the bipartisan group of parliamentarians who are trying to tackle the terrible harms from illicit drug use in Australia. This is a serious but separate problem, and it is interesting that the drugs doing the most human health harm through their abuse in Australia, of course, are the legal drugs, alcohol and nicotine. But having said that, the use of illegal drugs should not cloud our perspective or our compassion for those who could be treated to help their condition or who could have their cancer pain and suffering relieved at the end of their life when all else has failed. I've been contacted by one of my constituents describing the cruel suffering of her brother. He could have had some relief, she believes, if he'd been able to access medicinal cannabis in the last 12 months of his life. He couldn't eat. His condition was compounded by him literally starving, in addition to the terrible pains associated with the disease itself. She doesn't want anyone to ever suffer like that again. In another case, a constituent has spoken to me of her mental anguish as she watches her partner suffer in his final stages of a terrible cancer. It doesn't allow him to eat either. Being told medicinal cannabis could help, she is, as you can imagine, in a terrible state where she does not know where to get this. She's never broken the law in her life. She's got no idea who you approach, who sells illegal drugs, and of course she's worried sick that the marijuana she might buy mightn't be the appropriate type for relieving her husband's symptoms, and it could be cut with some other foreign substance which would make it in fact a danger to use. She's also terrified that if she did find the illicit marijuana, the illegal substance, in her effort to give her husband some last relief in his suffering, if she was caught buying that illegal drug, she could lose her job, and she's the only breadwinner. So here is an extraordinary situation of a woman who is told, and she's read all the literature, she's looked at the research from more than 90 countries. This is highly scientific and respected research, particularly from Germany. She knows that this substance, medicinal cannabis, could help her husband. She would at least like to try, but in Australia she can't. The key pieces of Commonwealth legislation that are activated by proposals for the introduction of a scheme dealing with medicinal cannabis include the Criminal Code Act 95, the Customs Act 1901, the Customs Prohibited Import Regulations 56, the Narcotic Drugs Act 67, the Therapeutic Drugs Act 1989, Crimes, Traffic in Narcotic Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act 1990. Now, these sound daunting. They seem almost impossible for us to start to chug through. But in New South Wales, Queensland and now Victoria, members of Parliament are saying enough is enough. It's time we joined the other developed countries in looking at decriminalising, making available medicinal cannabis. I know there are many on both sides of this House who share my views. I thank the House.